July 12, 1943, 0830 hours. Prokhorovka, Soviet Union, southwest of Kursk Salient. Lieutenant Anatoly Kozlov, 29 years old from Smolensk, sat in the commander's position of his T-34/76 tank, peering to the hatch-across flat steppe landscape. Around him, spread across 3 miles of rolling terrain, 800 Soviet tanks of the 5th Guards Tank Army prepared to attack. The scale was beyond anything Kozlov had witnessed in 2 years of war. Entire horizons filled with tanks, T-34 medium tanks, KV-1 heavy tanks, light tanks, self-propelled guns, thousands of men, hundreds of thousands of tons of steel. The rumble of engines was deafening. 800 tanks idling created sound that vibrated through ground, through metal, through bone. Exhaust fumes mixed with dust and morning mist. Visibility was already limited. Once battle began, it would become zero. Kozlov had received his orders at dawn. Attack straight ahead. Close with enemy immediately. Engage at point-blank range. Do not allow German tanks to use their superior guns at distance. Charge into German positions. Fight at 50 yards, 100 yards, ranges where German technological advantages meant nothing. This was suicide mission dressed as counterattack. Everyone knew it. No one questioned it. Across the steppe, 600 German tanks waited. Panzer Grenadier Division, Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, Das Reich Division, Totenkopf Division, elite SS formations equipped with newest and best German armor, Tiger heavy tanks with 88mm guns that could destroy any Soviet tank at 2 kilometers, Panther medium tanks with sloped armor and 75mm high-velocity guns, Panzer IV medium tanks upgraded with long-barrel 75mm guns. German crews were experienced, disciplined, confident. They'd been advancing for 7 days, destroying Soviet defensive positions, inflicting massive casualties. One more push would break through to Kursk. At 0830 hours, the order came. Attack. 800 Soviet tanks surged forward simultaneously. The ground shook. The noise became apocalyptic. This was Prokhorovka, the climax of Operation Citadel, the largest tank battle in military history. The day when 1,500 tanks collided in mutual destruction that would determine whether Germany could still win war in the East. This is the story of the Battle of Kursk, of the 2 weeks that tested Germany's last offensive capability against Soviet determination to absorb catastrophic losses and continue fighting, of Operation Citadel, where Wehrmacht committed 2,700 tanks and 900,000 troops to pincer attack on Kursk Salient, of Marshal Zhukov, who predicted German offensive and prepared defenses in depth that would bleed German armor, of July 12th at Prokhorovka, where Lieutenant General Pavel Rotmistrov ordered Suicidal. Charge at point-blank range to negate German advantages, of the 12 hours when visibility dropped to zero in smoke and flames and tanks fought at ranges measured in yards, and of how Germany's tactical victory became strategic defeat that ended offensive capability on Eastern Front forever. By spring 1943, the strategic situation on Eastern Front had stabilized into temporary equilibrium. The German offensive towards Stalingrad had ended in catastrophic defeat in February 1943. Over 300,000 German and Axis troops were killed or captured. The psychological impact was enormous. Germany was not invincible. The Wehrmacht to be defeated. But German forces weren't broken. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein's counteroffensive in February-March 1943 recaptured Kharkov and stabilized the front. The spring Rasputitsa, the mud season when roads became impassable, forced both sides into operational pause. This pause gave German high command time to plan summer offensive. The front line created a massive salient, a bulge in Soviet lines projecting westward around city of Kursk. The Kursk salient was roughly 150 miles wide north-south and 100 miles deep east-west. It contained substantial Soviet forces. Central Front commanded by General Konstantin Rokossovsky in the north, Voronezh Front commanded by General Nikolai Vatutin in the south. The salient was obvious target. Pincer attack from north and south could cut off Soviet forces, encircle entire armies, and potentially destabilize Soviet defensive line. Adolf Hitler saw Kursk offensive, codenamed Operation Citadel, as opportunity to regain initiative lost at Stalingrad. A decisive victory would demonstrate Germany still possessed offensive capability. It would boost morale of Wehrmacht and German people. It would potentially force Soviets to negotiate rather than continue grinding war of attrition. Most importantly, it would delay anticipated Allied invasion of Western Europe by demonstrating Germany could still win in East. The plan was straightforward. Army Group Center, commanded by Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, would attack from north with Ninth Army. Army Group South, commanded by Field Marshal von Manstein, would attack from south with 4th Panzer Army. The two forces would converge east of Kursk, encircling Soviet defenders. Classic German operational art. Pincer movements, encirclement, destruction of enemy forces. German forces committed to Citadel were formidable. Approximately 900,000 troops. 2,700 tanks and assault guns, including 146 Tiger I heavy tanks and 200 Panther medium tanks. The newest and most advanced German armor. 10,000 artillery pieces. 2,000 aircraft. This was the largest concentration of German armor since 1941 invasion. Every available reserve, every new production tank. Committed to Citadel, there would be no second chance. This offensive had to succeed, but operational security was non-existent. Soviet intelligence knew about Citadel months before it launched. Spy networks, signals intelligence, aerial reconnaissance, prisoner interrogations, all indicated German preparations for major offensive at Kursk. Stalin and Soviet High Command knew exactly what Germans planned. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, Deputy Supreme Commander of Soviet Armed Forces, advocated defensive strategy rather than launching preemptive offensive. Soviet forces would prepare defenses in depth, allow Germans to attack, absorb offensive in defensive belts, bleed German armor against prepared positions. When German offensive exhausted itself, launch massive counteroffensives that would destroy weakened German forces and recapture territory. The defensive preparations at Kursk were unprecedented in scale. Soviet forces constructed 8 defensive belts stretching 120 miles deep. Each belt contained trenches, anti-tank ditches, minefields, artillery positions, fortified strongpoints. Over 500,000 mines were laid. 20,000 artillery pieces positioned. The defenses were designed to channel German attacks into killing zones where massed anti-tank guns and artillery could engage at favorable ranges. Soviet forces in Kursk Salient numbered approximately 1.9 million troops, 5,000 tanks and assault guns, 25,000 artillery pieces and mortars, 2,900 aircraft. But more importantly, Soviet reserves positioned behind front numbered additional 500,000 troops and 1,500 tanks. These reserves, including 5th Guards Tank Army under Lieutenant General Pavel Rotmistrov, will be committed at critical moment to launch counterattacks. By July 1943, both sides were ready. Germany committed everything to Citadel. Soviets prepared to absorb offensive and counterattack. The stage was set for largest and bloodiest battle of Eastern Front. Operation Citadel began early morning July 5, 1943. German forces launched simultaneous offensives from north and south against Kursk Salient. The northern offensive by Ninth Army under General Walter Model made limited progress. Soviet defenses were stronger than expected. Minefields channeled German advances into killing zones. Anti-tank guns engaged German armor at ranges where German technological advantages were minimized. After 3 days, Ninth Army had advanced only 6 miles at cost of heavy casualties. The southern offensive by 4th Panzer Army under General Hermann Hoff made better progress. The 2 SS Panzer Corps, consisting of Leibstandarte, Das Reich, and Totenkopf divisions, broke through 1st Offensive Belt and advanced toward Prokhorovka. These were elite formations with experienced commanders and best equipment. Tiger and Panther tanks led attacks, destroying Soviet T-34s at long range. German infantry and engineers cleared obstacles. Artillery suppressed Soviet positions. The advance was methodical and costly but effective. Soviet defenders fought with determination and accepted catastrophic casualties. Entire battalions were destroyed, holding positions. Tank brigades were committed to counterattacks and annihilated. Artillery batteries fired until overrun. The defensive doctrine was clear: delay German advance, inflict maximum casualties, buy time for reserves to arrive. Soviet tactical defeats were acceptable if they achieved strategic purpose of exhausting German offensive. By July 11th, German southern forces approached Prokhorovka, a small railway town southwest of Kursk. Capturing Prokhorovka would open route north to Kursk and allow link-up with Ninth Army advancing from north. But German forces were exhausted. 7 days continuous combat, heavy casualties, mechanical breakdowns, fuel and ammunition consumption exceeding supply rates. The offensive was losing momentum. Marshal Wittmann, commanding Voronezh Front, and Marshal Zhukov made critical decision. Commit 5th Guards Tank Army to counterattack at Prokhorovka on July 12th. This counterattack would stop German advance, possibly destroy 2 SS Panzer Corps, and force Germans onto defensive. The risk was enormous. 5th Guards Tank Army represented strategic reserve. If destroyed without achieving results, Soviet position would be critical, but necessity demanded action. Lieutenant General Pavel Rotmistrov commanded 5th Guards Tank Army. Rotmistrov was an experienced tank commander who understood both capabilities and limitations of Soviet armor. T-34 medium tanks were reliable, mobile, and produced in thousands. But against German Tigers and Panthers at long range, they were outmatched. German 88mm guns could penetrate T-34 armor at 2,000 meters. T-34 76mm gun could only penetrate Tiger frontal armor at ranges under 500 meters. If lucky, the technological disparity was severe. Rotmistrov's solution was tactical rather than technological. Negate German range advantage by attacking at point-blank range. Charge directly into German positions. Close distance immediately to ranges where German guns couldn't fire before Soviet tanks were among them. Accept catastrophic losses in approach, but achieve tactical success by disrupting German formations. This was Soviet doctrine distilled to essence. Accept losses to achieve objectives. July 12, 1943. At dawn, Rotmistrov briefed his commanders. The 18th Tank Corps and 29th Tank Corps would attack frontally toward German positions. Approximately 800 tanks would advance across 3 miles of open steppe. They would close with enemy immediately, fight at close range, destroy German tanks through superior numbers and aggression. There was no subtlety, no maneuver, just mass and violence. The German forces at Prokhorovka represented Wehrmacht's elite. 2 SS Panzer Corps consisted of 3 Waffen-SS divisions, Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, Das Reich, and Totenkopf. These weren't regular army units. They were ideologically motivated, fanatically determined, and equipped with best available equipment. Leibstandarte Division held positions directly in path of Soviet attack. The division possessed approximately 200 tanks, including 13 Tiger I heavy tanks. Each Tiger weighed 57 tons, mounted 88mm gun that could destroy any Soviet tank at extreme range, and had frontal armor nearly impervious to Soviet 76mm guns. Tiger commanders were confident, experienced, aware of their advantages. Supporting Tigers were Panther medium tanks, Germany's answer to T-34. Panthers had sloped armor, excellent mobility, and 75mm high-velocity guns. They were technologically superior to T-34 in firepower and protection. But Panthers were new. Many had mechanical problems. Crews were still learning capabilities and limitations. The bulk of German strength consisted of upgraded Panzer IV medium tanks with long-barrel 75mm guns. These were reliable, proven designs that could engage Soviet tanks effectively at normal combat ranges. German crews were experienced. They'd been fighting for 7 days, destroying Soviet tanks, advancing steadily. Morale was high despite exhaustion. German defensive positions exploited terrain. Prokhorovka area was relatively flat steppe with gentle hills and small river valleys. Germans positioned tanks on reverse slopes of hills in hull-down positions where only turrets were exposed. This maximized arm protection and minimized target profile. Anti-tank guns were positioned to create interlocking fields of fire. Infantry dug in with Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons. Artillery zeroed in on likely Soviet approach routes. The German plan for July 12th was to continue offensive toward Prokhorovka village, attack at first light, use Tigers and Panthers to destroy Soviet tanks at long range. Infantry would clear defensive positions. By evening, German forces would control Prokhorovka and prepare for final push north to Kursk. Victory seemed achievable. Soviet resistance was weakening. One more effort would break through. What Germans didn't expect was 800 Soviet tanks appearing at dawn and charging directly into their positions. At 0830 hours on July 12, 1943, 800 Soviet tanks began advancing toward German positions. The initial deployment was textbook. 3 waves of armor. First wave T-34 medium tanks and KV-1 heavy tanks. Second wave more T-34s and self-propelled guns. Third wave reserves and support vehicles. The formation covered 3 miles front. Depth was approximately 2 miles. It was still avalanche. Lieutenant Anatoly Kozlov's T-34 was in first wave. His crew consisted of driver, gunner, loader, and hull machine gunner. They'd been fighting together for 6 months. They'd survived when most crews died. Experience counted for something, but not much when charging toward Tigers. The terrain between Soviet start line and German positions was roughly 4 miles of open steppe, gentle rolling hills, fields, small ravines. There was no cover, no concealment. German observers could see Soviet tanks immediately. German artillery began firing within minutes. Artillery shells exploded among advancing tanks. Direct hits destroyed or disabled tanks. Near misses showered tanks with shrapnel. But Soviet tanks kept advancing. Orders were clear. Don't stop. Don't take cover. Advance at maximum speed. Close distance. Engage Germans at point-blank range. German tanks began firing at approximately 1,500 meters. Long-range shots. Tiger 88mm guns and Panther 75mm guns were accurate at this distance. Soviet tanks began exploding. Penetrated hits caused catastrophic ammunition fires. Turrets were blown off. Tanks burst into flames. Crews who survived initial penetration bailed out and ran. Many were machine gunned by German infantry. The Soviet first wave began taking heavy casualties before firing single shot, but the mass kept advancing. For every tank destroyed, 3 more continued. The Soviet formation began losing cohesion. Destroyed tanks created obstacles. Tanks maneuvered around casualties and smoke. Formations fragmented into groups and individual tanks. But the advance continued. At 1,000 meters, Soviet tanks began returning fire. T-34 76mm guns engaged German tanks. Most shots missed or bounced off German armor at this range. But volume of fire increased. German tanks had to maneuver. German crews had to acquire targets, fire, reload. The Soviet advance accelerated. Gaps in German positions appeared as individual tanks displaced or withdrew. At 500 meters, the charge became chaos. Soviet tanks at maximum speed, closing final distance. German tanks firing desperately. Artillery from both sides landing randomly. Smoke from burning tanks reduced visibility. Dust from explosions and tank movement created fog. The battlefield became hell of noise, smoke, fire, confusion. At 100 meters, Soviet and German tanks collided in close-quarters melee that had no precedent in mechanized warfare. The fighting at Prokhorovka from 0900 to 1200 hours on July 12th was unlike any previous tank battle. Normal tank combat occurred at ranges of 800 to 2,000 meters, where crews could acquire targets, aim carefully, fire precisely. Prokhorovka combat occurred at ranges of 50 to 200 meters, distances where tanks appeared suddenly through smoke, fired at point-blank range, and died in seconds. Lieutenant Kozlov's T-34 charged through smoke and saw a German Panzer for directly ahead at perhaps 100 meters. His gunner fired without waiting for order. The 76mm armor-piercing round struck Panzer IV turret. Penetration. The German tank exploded. Kozlov's tank drove past burning wreck and immediately encountered another German tank, this one a Panther. At 50 meters, the Panther couldn't depress gun low enough to hit T-34 hull. Kozlov's driver rammed the Panther, tank-on-tank collision that disabled both vehicles. Kozlov's crew bailed out and ran through smoke, looking for another tank to commandeer. This scene repeated across entire battlefield. Tanks appearing through smoke at ranges measured in yards. Shots fired at point-blank range where missing was almost impossible. Tanks ramming each other. Crews bailing out and being shot by infantry or killed by artillery. Some T-34 crews, after their tanks were disabled, attacked German tanks with grenades and Molotov cocktails. Some German crews, after running out of ammunition, fought Soviet infantry with submachine guns and pistols. The battle became primordial, fire, steel, and violence without strategy or tactics. The close-range fighting negated many German advantages. Tiger and Panther superior armor and guns meant less when Soviet T-34 could fire into side or rear armor at 50 meters. The 76mm gun that was inadequate at 1,500 meters was lethal at 50 meters against any target. Soviet numerical superiority, 800 tanks against 600, became decisive when combat reduced to melee, but Soviet casualties were catastrophic. The initial charge across 4 miles of open ground under German long-range fire destroyed dozens of tanks before Soviets could return fire. The close-quarters fighting, while negating German technological advantages, still resulted in heavy Soviet losses. German crews were more experienced. German mechanical reliability was better. Individual German tanks often destroyed multiple Soviet tanks before being knocked out themselves. The battlefield became graveyard. Burning tanks created pillars of smoke visible for miles. Exploded tanks littered the ground, some overturned, some with turrets blown 50 meters away. Some collapsed into shell holes. Abandoned tanks with dead crews inside. Wounded tankers crawling away from wrecks. Dead tankers scattered across ground. Grass and crops burning. The heat was intense. The smoke was choking. Visibility dropped to near zero. Artillery from both sides continued firing throughout. Soviet Katyusha rocket launchers, Stalin's organs, fired salvos at saturated areas with explosions. German Nebelwerfer rocket launchers responded. Both sides' conventional artillery fired continuously. The sound was constant rolling thunder. Shell fragments killed tank crews who bailed out. Direct hits destroyed already disabled tanks. Artillery created additional smoke and dust that reduced visibility further. Soviet infantry supporting tank attack fought German infantry in close quarters. Soviet infantrymen attacked German positions with submachine guns, grenades, bayonets. German infantry defended with machine guns, mortars, Panzerfausts. The infantry fighting was as brutal as tank fighting. Trenches changed hands multiple times. Strong points were overrun, recaptured, overrun again. Casualties mounted on both sides. By noon, the fighting had continued for over 3 hours. The battlefield was complete chaos. Neither side had clear picture of situation. Communications were disrupted. Commanders lost contact with subordinate units. Individual tanks and small groups fought independently. There was no front line, just scattered groups of tanks from both sides intermixed across several square miles. The Tiger I heavy tanks represented Germany's most powerful armor. Each Tiger was mobile fortress. 57 tons, 88 millimeters gun, armor up to 120 millimeters thick on front. Tigers were designed to engage enemy tanks at long range, where German gunnery superiority and armor protection were decisive. Prokhorovka close-range melee negated these advantages. SS Hauptsturmführer Michael Wittmann, commanding Tiger from Leibstandarte Division, found himself surrounded by Soviet tanks at ranges where his Tiger's advantages meant little. Wittmann was an experienced commander who would become Germany's highest-scoring tank ace. But at Prokhorovka, experience and skill barely mattered in chaos of close-range combat. Wittmann's Tiger engaged Soviet T-34s at ranges under 200 meters. The 88 millimeters gun destroyed every tank hit. But Soviet tanks appeared from multiple directions simultaneously. Wittmann's crew fired, reloaded, acquired new target, fired again. The Tiger's main gun could fire approximately 8 to 10 rounds per minute under ideal conditions. At Prokhorovka, with targets appearing constantly from smoke, rate of fire determined survival. Wittmann's Tiger destroyed 8 Soviet tanks in 20 minutes. But Tigers weren't invincible at close range. T-34s firing at Tiger's side or rear armor could penetrate. Soviet tanks trying to ram Tigers could immobilize them. Soviet infantry with anti-tank grenades could damage tracks or external fittings. Wittmann's Tiger was hit multiple times. Rounds that penetrated but didn't fully destroy the tank. Rounds that damaged optics and external equipment. Rounds that wounded crew members. After sustaining multiple hits and running low on ammunition, Wittmann withdrew his Tiger from immediate combat. The withdrawal under fire, backing up while engaging pursuing Soviet tanks, was dangerous maneuver that required skilled driver and crew coordination. Wittmann's crew executed withdrawal successfully, but many other Tiger crews weren't as fortunate. Several Tigers were destroyed at Prokhorovka through cumulative damage rather than single catastrophic hit. Multiple penetrations, fires that couldn't be suppressed, mechanical breakdowns caused by combat damage, or simple exhaustion of ammunition. Tigers withdrawn from combat often couldn't be recovered due to Soviet artillery and continued fighting. They were destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture. The Tiger battalions at Prokhorovka demonstrated both strengths and limitations of German heavy armor. Individual Tigers destroyed multiple Soviet tanks. German crews displayed superior training and tactical skill. But Tigers couldn't be everywhere simultaneously. They couldn't engage multiple threats from multiple directions. They required infantry and artillery support that wasn't always available in chaos of close-range tank battle. Of 13 Tigers committed by Leibstandarte Division at Prokhorovka, approximately 3 were total losses, destroyed beyond repair. Another 5 sustained damage requiring extensive repair. The remainder withdrew under their own power, but many needed track or engine repairs. The Tiger Battalion was combat ineffective for days after Prokhorovka, despite not being completely destroyed. This pattern, temporary degradation rather than annihilation, characterized Prokhorovka outcomes for both sides. Soviet casualties at Prokhorovka were staggering. Exact figures remain disputed, but conservative estimates suggest 5th Guards Tank Army lost approximately 340 tanks destroyed or disabled on July 12th. This represented roughly 40% of committed armor lost in single day. By any measure, this was catastrophic loss rate. Lieutenant Kozlov, after his T-34 was disabled ramming German Panther, commandeered abandoned T-34 from killed crew. This tank was hit within 30 minutes. Armor penetration that killed driver and gunner. Kozlov survived with shrapnel wounds and burns. He spent remainder of July 12th as infantryman, fighting German positions with submachine gun until evacuated that evening. His experience, multiple tanks destroyed, crew casualties, eventual evacuation, was typical for Soviet tankers at Prokhorovka. The human cost was severe. Each destroyed tank meant 4 or 5 casualties, dead, wounded, or missing. Tank crews who survived initial penetration often died trying to bail out under fire or were killed by artillery. Soviet medical services were overwhelmed. Wounded tankers were evacuated when possible, but many died waiting for treatment. Burn injuries were particularly horrible. Tank fires reached extreme temperatures. Fuel and ammunition explosions caused severe burns. Smoke inhalation damaged lungs. The Soviet replacement system allowed rapid reconstitution of units despite heavy losses. New tanks were delivered from factories operating behind front lines. Replacement crews were drawn from training depots. Within days, 5th Guards Tank Army would return to combat strength. Different tanks, different crews, same unit designation. This Soviet ability to absorb losses and regenerate combat power was strategic advantage Germans couldn't match. But individual experiences of loss were devastating. Tank crews formed tight bonds, 4 or 5 men living in cramped metal box, depending on each other for survival. When tank was destroyed, survivors felt grief for killed crew members, guilt about surviving when friends died, fear about next battle. Soviet tankers at Prokhorovka experienced trauma comparable to infantry combat, perhaps worse because tank offered illusion protection that proved false when armor was penetrated. The political officers, commissars attached to every Soviet unit, worked to maintain morale despite losses. They emphasized patriotic duty, defense of motherland, necessity of sacrifice. They identified potential defeatism and dealt with it harshly. They recommended medals and promotions for heroism. This combination of inspiration and intimidation kept Soviet units fighting despite catastrophic casualties. Soviet doctrine accepted heavy casualties as necessary cost of operations. The numerical superiority of Soviet forces, larger population, greater industrial capacity, ability to replace losses, meant that trade ratios favoring Germans were strategically acceptable if German losses were irreplaceable. At Prokhorovka, Soviets lost more tanks than Germans. But Germany couldn't replace losses. Soviets could. This arithmetic, brutal and cold, defined Eastern Front warfare. German forces at Prokhorovka achieved tactical victory on July 12th. They held their positions. They destroyed more Soviet tanks than they lost. Approximately 340 Soviet destroyed versus 80 to 100 German destroyed. By traditional metrics of military success, Germans won battle. SS Brigade Führer Theodor Wisch, commanding Leibstandarte Division, reported to Corps headquarters that Soviet attack had been repulsed with heavy enemy losses. German lines held, enemy destroyed in large numbers. Leibstandarte ready to continue offensive toward Kursk. The report was accurate regarding tactical situation, but missed strategic reality. The strategic reality was that Operation Citadel had failed. German offensive culminated at Prokhorovka. Further advance was impossible. German forces had suffered 8 days of continuous combat. Casualties were heavy. Mechanical breakdowns reduced tank strength. Fuel and ammunition were low. Infantry was exhausted. Supporting arms were depleted. Most critically, Germans had committed entire strategic reserve to Citadel. There were no fresh divisions available. Every tank, every battalion, already engaged. Meanwhile, Soviet reserves were arriving. Fresh armies, new tanks, additional artillery. The Soviet strategic depth, ability to commit reinforcements while absorbing losses, meant that even after Prokhorovka, Soviet forces could continue operations. Germans couldn't. Field Marshal von Manstein, commanding Army Group South, requested permission to continue offensive. He argued breakthrough was achievable with few more days of operations. His request was denied. Hitler, receiving reports of Allied landing in Sicily on July 10th, ordered suspension of Citadel and withdrawal of 2 SS Panzer Corps for redeployment to Italy. The Eastern Front offensive ended not because Germans were defeated tactically, but because Germany couldn't sustain strategic effort on multiple fronts simultaneously. The German withdrawal from Prokhorovka began July 16th. Units disengaged under pressure from Soviet counterattacks. The withdrawal was conducted professionally. Rear guards held positions while main forces fell back. Disabled vehicles were destroyed or recovered. Wounded were evacuated. But withdrawal was admission that Citadel had failed. German casualties for Operation Citadel, July 5th to 23rd, totaled approximately 250,000 killed, wounded, missing, including approximately 50,000 killed. Tank losses were roughly 760 destroyed or damaged beyond quick repair from original commitment of 2,700. These losses were unsustainable. Germany didn't have manpower or industrial capacity to regenerate offensive capability. More critically, Citadel failure meant Germany permanently lost initiative on Eastern Front. Never again would Wehrmacht launch major offensive operation in East. Every subsequent German operation would be reactive. Defensive battles, counterattacks, withdrawals. Strategic initiative passed the Soviets, who would maintain it until Berlin fell in May 1945. German commanders and soldiers who fought at Kursk understood implications. They committed everything, best troops, newest equipment, maximum effort, and failed. Soviet ability to absorb catastrophic losses and continue fighting demonstrated that war of attrition favored Soviets. German technological superiority, Tigers, Panthers, superior training, couldn't compensate for Soviet numerical superiority and strategic depth. Individual German soldiers who survived Prokhorovka described it as more terrifying than any previous combat. The close-range melee, visibility zero and smoke, Soviet tanks appearing suddenly at point-blank range, constant artillery, 12 hours of continuous combat without pause. These experiences traumatized even veteran troops. German confidence, which had sustained Wehrmacht through 2 years of Eastern Front combat, began eroding after Kursk. The fighting at Prokhorovka continued throughout afternoon and evening of July 12th, though intensity gradually decreased. By noon, both sides were exhausted. Tank crews had been fighting for 4 hours in extreme conditions: heat, smoke, noise, stress. Ammunition was depleted. Fuel was low. Crews were physically and mentally drained. But combat didn't stop. Small group actions continued across battlefield. Individual German tanks engaged small groups of Soviet tanks at ranges where visibility permitted. Soviet infantry infiltrated German positions. Artillery from both sides continued firing. The afternoon fighting was less intense than morning melee, but still deadly. German forces attempted to consolidate positions and prepare for expected renewed Soviet attacks. Tank units withdrew from forward positions to assembly areas where damaged vehicles could be repaired, ammunition resupplied, fuel replenished. German infantry strengthened defensive positions. Artillery registered new fire missions. The Germans were preparing to defend rather than attack. Significant shift from operational posture of previous 8 days. Soviet forces also consolidated. Units were reorganized. Survivors from destroyed tank battalions were formed into composite units. Reserves were brought forward. Additional artillery was positioned. But Soviet commanders recognized 5th Guard's tank army was combat ineffective for immediate offensive operations. July 12th attack had failed to destroy 2 SS Panzer Corps or force German withdrawal. Heavy losses meant army needed time to reconstitute before launching another major attack. The battlefield itself was scene of horror. Hundreds of destroyed and burning tanks scattered across miles of steppe. Bodies of tank crews, Soviet and German, lying near destroyed vehicles. Wounded men calling for help. Some wounded were reached by medics and evacuated. Others died waiting. Some wounded crawled into destroyed tanks, seeking shade from sun, and died there. The recovery crews who later cleared battlefield found bodies inside and outside tanks, some burned beyond recognition, others killed by artillery or small arms. The smell was overwhelming. Burning fuel, burning rubber, burning flesh. The smoke continued throughout day and into night. Fires from destroyed tanks burned for hours. Ammunition inside destroyed tanks cooked off, exploded from heat, creating continued danger. Recovery crews couldn't approach some destroyed tanks until fires burned out completely. By evening July 12th, both sides claimed victory. Soviet reports emphasized that German offensive had been stopped. Enemies suffered heavy losses. Heroic Soviet tankers defeated fascist invaders. These claims were accurate regarding strategic outcome. German offensive did stop, but obscured Soviet tactical failure and heavy losses. German reports emphasize Soviet losses. Enemy attack repulsed. Soviet tanks destroyed in large numbers. German positions held. These claims were accurate regarding tactical outcome, but missed strategic reality that Citadel had failed and German offensive capability was exhausted. While fighting continued at Prokhorovka, Soviet forces launched counteroffensives north and south of Kursk Salient. These counteroffensives began July 12th, same day as Prokhorovka, and demonstrated Soviet strategic planning. The defensive battle at Kursk was never intended as end in itself. Soviet plan always included transition to offensive once German attack exhausted itself. Operation Kutuzov, launched July 12th against German positions north of Kursk Salient, targeted German Ninth Army, which had been attacking southward. Soviet Western Front and Bryansk Front attacked with overwhelming numerical superiority. German Ninth Army, already weakened by week of offensive combat and heavy losses, couldn't hold. German forces began withdrawing July 15th. Soviet advance recaptured Orel by August 5th, city that had been in German hands since October 1941. Operation Polkovodets-Rumiantsev, launched August 3rd south of Kursk, targeted German positions around Kharkov. This offensive involved 5 Soviet armies, including reconstituted 5th Guards Tank Army. German forces at Kharkov were weakened by Citadel losses and withdrawal of 2 SS Panzer Corps to Italy. Soviet numerical superiority was overwhelming. Kharkov fell to Soviet forces August 23rd after bitter fighting. The Soviet counteroffensives following Kursk demonstrated several important factors. First, Soviet ability to plan and execute major operations while conducting defensive battles showed sophisticated operational art. Second, Soviet numerical superiority, ability to commit fresh armies while German forces were exhausted, made Soviet offensives extremely difficult to stop. Third, Soviet willingness to accept casualties to achieve objectives remained unchanged. Counteroffensives caused hundreds of thousands of Soviet casualties, but achieved strategic goals of recapturing territory and pushing Germans back. By end of August 1943, German forces had been pushed back approximately 150 miles from furthest advance during Citadel. Orel and Kharkov, major cities, were in Soviet hands. German defensive line was broken in multiple places. Most importantly, strategic initiative on Eastern Front had permanently shifted to Soviets. Germany would never again mount major offensive in East. Operation Citadel and subsequent Soviet counteroffensives, July 5th to August 23rd, 1943, produced staggering casualties on both sides. Exact figures remain disputed due to different counting methodologies and wartime record-keeping, but scale is clear. German casualties for Citadel, July 5th to 23rd, totaled approximately 250,000 killed, wounded, missing. This included roughly 50,000 killed. Tank losses were approximately 760 destroyed or damaged beyond immediate repair from original 2,700 committed. Aircraft losses exceeded 500. These losses were catastrophic for Wehrmacht, which lacked manpower and industrial capacity to replace them quickly. Soviet casualties for defensive phase at Kursk and Prokhorovka, July 5th to 23rd, totaled approximately 650,000 killed, wounded, missing. This included roughly 200,000 killed. Tank losses exceeded 1,800 destroyed or damaged. Aircraft losses exceeded 1,000. These losses were higher than German casualties by every metric. But Soviet replacement system allowed units to reconstitute, while German units remained under strength. Soviet casualties for counteroffensives, July 12th to August 23rd, added approximately 500,000 additional killed, wounded, missing. Combined Soviet casualties for entire Kursk operation and counteroffensives approached 1.2 million, 5 times German casualties. By traditional military metrics, this would represent Soviet defeat. But strategic outcome demonstrated that casualty arithmetic alone didn't determine victory on Eastern Front. The human cost behind statistics was immense. Every casualty represented individual tragedy. Soldier killed or wounded, family receiving telegram, community losing member. Soviet society bore a burden of these losses across entire population. German society, already strained by casualties from 2 years of Eastern Front combat and strategic bombing campaign, began showing signs of war weariness. Tank losses at Prokhorovka specifically, approximately 340 Soviet destroyed versus 80 to 100 German, illustrated tactical disparity in combat effectiveness. German crews, vehicles, and tactics were superior at individual engagement level. But strategic outcome, German offensive stopped. Soviet forces able to continue operations. demonstrated that tactical superiority didn't ensure strategic success. Operation Citadel failed for multiple interrelated reasons that revealed fundamental problems with German strategic position by mid-1943. Intelligence failure was critical. Soviet knowledge of German plans allowed months of defensive preparation, 8 defensive belts, 500,000 mines, positioned anti-tank guns, prepared artillery fire plans, all made German offensive far more costly than anticipated. German intelligence underestimated both Soviet defensive preparations and Soviet willingness to accept casualties defending Kursk salient. Operational delays proved fatal. Citadel was originally planned for May 1943, but delayed until July to allow new Panthers and Tigers to reach units. These delays gave Soviets additional months to prepare defenses. Panthers arrived with mechanical problems. Many broke down before reaching combat. The technological advantages didn't compensate for a strategic disadvantage of delayed offensive. Soviet strategic depth, ability to commit reserves while absorbing losses, meant German offensive faced ever-increasing resistance. At Prokhorovka, commitment of 5th Guards Tank Army demonstrated Soviet ability to bring fresh forces into battle when German forces were exhausted. German strategic reserve was committed on day 1. Soviets committed reserves on day 8. This disparity in strategic depth made German victory impossible. Logistics constrained German operations. Fuel shortages limited mobility. Ammunition expenditure exceeded resupply rates. Maintenance of tanks in continuous combat reduced available vehicles. German logistics system, adequate for short victorious campaigns, couldn't sustain prolonged offensive against prepared defenses. Most fundamentally, Germany lacked manpower and industrial capacity to sustain attrition warfare against Soviet Union. Soviet population was larger. Soviet industrial production was greater. Soviet willingness to accept casualties was higher. Every loss Germany suffered was harder to replace than Soviet losses. Mathematical inevitability of attrition warfare favored Soviets by mid-1943. German commanders understood these problems but couldn't solve them. Von Manstein argued for mobile defense. Trade space for time, conduct counterattacks against extended Soviet offensives, inflict casualties at favorable ratios. Hitler rejected mobile defense, insisting on holding every position. This strategic inflexibility made German defeats more costly and Soviet victories easier. The failure at Kursk marked end of German offensive capability in East. Every subsequent operation would be defensive or reactive. Strategic initiative passed the Soviets permanently. Germany would fight increasingly desperate defensive battles for next 2 years until final defeat in May 1945. Soviet victory at Kursk demonstrated that Red Army had evolved from desperate defenders of 1941 to 42 into capable offensive force by 1943. This evolution occurred through painful experience, massive casualties, and institutional learning. Soviet defensive doctrine at Kursk, defense in depth with multiple belts, minefields channeling attacks into killing zones, anti-tank guns engaging at favorable ranges, artillery providing continuous fire support, with sophisticated application of tactical lessons learned over 2 years of combat. Soviet commanders understood German operational methods and prepared defenses specifically to counter them. Soviet offensive doctrine, as demonstrated at Prokhorovka and subsequent counteroffensives, emphasized mass momentum and willingness to accept casualties. Rotmistrov's charge at Prokhorovka was deliberately sacrificial. Soviet commanders knew losses would be heavy. They accepted this because alternative, allowing Germans to maintain range advantage, would result in defeat without inflicting damage on Germans. The Soviet replacement system allowed sustained operations despite heavy losses. Factories in Urals and Siberia produced thousands of tanks monthly. Training depots graduated new crews continuously. Political system mobilized entire society for war effort. This systemic advantage, ability to replace losses faster than enemy, proved decisive by 1943. Soviet willingness to accept casualties disturbed German commanders who operated within different ethical and operational frameworks. German doctrine emphasized reserving experienced troops and avoiding unnecessary losses. Soviet doctrine emphasized achieving objectives regardless of cost. Neither approach was inherently superior. Outcomes depended on strategic context. By 1943, strategic context favored Soviet approach. Individual Soviet soldiers and commanders who fought at Kursk experienced mix of pride and trauma. Pride because they'd stopped German offensive and contributed to Soviet victory. Trauma because costs were so high. Friends killed, units destroyed, violence witnessed. Soviet veterans rarely discuss these experiences publicly due to political pressure to maintain heroic narrative. But private accounts reveal psychological toll comparable to veterans of any intense combat. Prokhorovka became centerpiece of Soviet propaganda about Great Patriotic War. Soviet accounts emphasized heroic tank charge that destroyed fascist forces and saved motherland. These accounts minimized Soviet losses and exaggerated German casualties. The actual tactical defeat, 340 Soviet tanks destroyed versus 80 to 100 German, was transformed into glorious victory through selective reporting. Soviet historians writing during Stalin era and Cold War period describe Prokhorovka as decisive battle where Soviet technological and tactical superiority defeated Germans. Reality: that Soviet tanks were technologically inferior and tactics were deliberately sacrificial contradicted desired narrative. Official histories couldn't acknowledge that victory came through accepting catastrophic losses rather than superior equipment or tactics. Veterans who participated in Prokhorovka and survived were celebrated as heroes. Their experiences were curated through propaganda lens. Stories of individual heroism were emphasized. Unit casualties were minimized. The strategic success, stopping German offensive, was conflated with tactical victory that didn't occur. Veterans who contradicted official narrative faced consequences, ranging from social ostracism to political persecution. The Prokhorovka myth served political purposes during Soviet period. It demonstrated communist systems' ability to mobilize masses for total war. It showed capitalist/fascist technology could be defeated by socialist heroism and Soviet determination. It provided inspiration for subsequent generations. These propaganda functions were considered more important than historical accuracy. After Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Russian and Western historians gained access to archives that revealed actual casualty figures and tactical outcomes at Prokhorovka. German archives confirmed lower German losses than Soviet propaganda claimed. Soviet archives revealed higher Soviet losses than officially acknowledged. The historical revisionism created controversy in Russia, where Great Patriotic War remains sacred narrative. Modern Russian government maintains carefully balanced position, acknowledging Soviet losses were higher than previously stated while emphasizing strategic victory and sacrifice of Soviet soldiers. Prokhorovka remains symbol of Soviet determination, but with more realistic understanding of costs involved. Prokhorovka holds distinction of largest tank battle in military history. Approximately 1,500 tanks engaged in single day, July 12, 1943, across relatively confined area. No subsequent battle matched this concentration of armor in direct combat. The scale of Prokhorovka resulted from convergence of multiple factors. Strategic importance of Kursk operation caused both sides to commit maximum available armor. Operational necessity, German need to break through. Soviet determination to stop breakthrough created conditions for direct engagement. Tactical decisions, Rotmistrov's charge, German defensive positioning, brought opposing tank forces into contact simultaneously across wide front. Later tank battles in World War II involved more total tanks, but spread over larger areas or longer time frames. The Battle of Brody, June 1941, involved large numbers of tanks, but was spread across several days and multiple locations. Israeli-Arab wars involved substantial armor, but not concentrated single-day engagements approaching Prokhorovka scale. Modern tank battles are unlikely to match Prokhorovka scale due to changes in warfare. Precision weapons, anti-tank missiles, attack helicopters, precision artillery make large concentrations of armor vulnerable. Tank warfare emphasizes mobility and combined arms rather than mass. Technology enables destruction of armor at distances that preclude Prokhorovka-style close-range melee. Prokhorovka remains historical benchmark for tank combat intensity. Military historians and armor officers study Prokhorovka as example of extreme combat conditions: close-range engagement, limited visibility, high casualties, psychological stress. The tactical lessons: importance of combined arms, vulnerability of concentrated armor, cost of frontal assault, remain relevant despite technological changes. German commanders and soldiers who survived Kursk recognized Operation marked turning point. Citadel represented Germany's last major offensive capability in East. Failure meant Wehrmacht would fight defensive war for duration. This realization affected morale and strategic planning. General Heinz Guderian, Inspector General of Panzer troops, opposed Citadel from planning stages. He argued German tank strength should be preserved for defensive operations rather than expended in offensive that Soviet defenses would bleed dry. After Citadel failed, Guderian's position was vindicated, but vindication came too late. German armor losses at Kursk couldn't be replaced before Soviets launched major offensives that Wehrmacht lacked strength to stop. German tank commanders who fought at Prokhorovka described tactical frustration. Tigers and Panthers could destroy Soviet tanks at long range. But Soviet mass charges at close range negated technological advantages. German crews felt they were technically superior but strategically defeated. This cognitive dissonance, winning individual engagements while losing strategic campaign, characterized German experience in late war period. The psychological impact on German troops was severe. Propaganda had emphasized German superiority and inevitable victory. Kursk demonstrated that Soviet Union could not be defeated militarily. German soldiers increasingly questioned whether war could be won. Morale declined. Desertion increased. Ideological commitment to Nazi caused weakened accept among fanatics. German military effectiveness declined after Kursk despite maintaining tactical proficiency. Units remained disciplined and capable of local counterattacks. But strategic initiative passed the Soviets. German forces fought series of retreating battles over the next 2 years, trading space for time, delaying rather than preventing Soviet advance. Soviet commanders and soldiers viewed Kursk as vindication of Red Army's evolution from disaster of 1941 to capability by 1943. The ability to stop German offensive through prepared defenses demonstrated institutional learning. The successful counteroffensives demonstrated offensive capability. Victory at Kursk proved Soviet Union could win war. Marshal Zhukov's defensive strategy allowed Germans to attack, absorb offensive and prepared defenses, counterattack with reserves, became model for subsequent operations. Soviet commanders gained confidence in their ability to plan and execute complex operations involving millions of troops. This confidence translated into increasingly ambitious offensives that would drive Germans back to Berlin. Soviet soldiers who survived Kursk experienced mix of emotions: pride in victory, grief for casualties, determination to continue fighting. The propaganda narrative, heroic Soviet forces defeating fascist invaders, resonated with soldiers' experiences even when specific details were distorted. They had fought. Friends had died. Enemy had been defeated. These facts mattered more than tactical details about casualty ratios. The strategic impact of Kursk on Soviet operations was immediate. Following Kursk, Red Army launched series of offensives: August 1943 Kharkov, autumn 1943 Dnieper River crossings, winter 1943 the 44 relief of Leningrad, summer 1944 Operation Bagration. Each offensive pushed Germans further back. Each victory increased Soviet confidence and decreased German capability. By 1944, Red Army was conducting operations of scale and sophistication that would have been impossible in 1941 to 42. Multi-front coordinated offensives, deep penetrations, encirclements. The institutional learning that occurred between 1941 and 1944 transformed Red Army from defeated force into a war-winning machine. Kursk was a critical step in this evolution. Kursk influenced tank development for the remainder of war and beyond. Both sides drew lessons from combat that shaped subsequent designs. German lessons emphasized continued technological superiority. Tigers and Panthers performed well at Kursk despite operational failures. German response was to develop even more powerful tanks. Tiger II with 88mm L/71 gun, heavier armor, but emphasis on technological sophistication created production bottlenecks. German factories produced fewer but more capable tanks. This proved disadvantageous against Soviet mass production of adequate tanks. Soviet lessons emphasized reliability and mass production over technological sophistication. T-34 was adequate against most German armor when employed correctly. Soviet response to Tigers and Panthers was upgun T-34/85 with 85mm gun that can engage German heavy armor at reasonable ranges. But Soviets also continued producing massive numbers of standard T-34/76. Quantity remained priority over quality. The close-range fighting at Prokhorovka demonstrated importance of factors beyond armor and gun performance. Crew training, battlefield awareness, combined arms support logistics. These factors often determine outcomes as much as vehicle specifications. Post-war tank development emphasized these factors alongside technological improvements. Modern main battle tanks trace lineage partly to lessons of Kursk. Balance between firepower, protection, and mobility. Importance of crew survivability. Need for reliability in sustained operations. These principles, validated through combat at Kursk, remain fundamental to armored warfare doctrine. Prokhorovka battlefield is commemorated extensively in Russia. The site is sacred ground in Russian military tradition and national identity. Multiple memorials honor Soviet soldiers who fought and died there. The Bell Tower of Unconquered, completed in 1995, is 59-meter tall bell tower at Prokhorovka battlefield. The structure rings bells every 20 minutes commemorating Soviet casualties. Interior contains names of Soviet soldiers killed at Kursk. The memorial serves both as remembrance site and national symbol of Soviet sacrifice in Great Patriotic War. The Prokhorovka Tank Battle Museum, opened 2010, contains exhibits documenting battle with artifacts, photographs, documents. The museum presents Russian government's interpretation of battle, emphasizing heroism and sacrifice while acknowledging higher casualties than Soviet-era propaganda admitted. The museum attracts Russian and international visitors interested in World War II history. The museum reserve includes recreated defensive positions, preserved German and Soviet tanks, educational programs. The site hosts annual commemorations on July 12th anniversary. Veterans, few remaining, families, government officials, military personnel gather to honor those who fought. The ceremonies include military parades, wreath-laying, speeches emphasizing continuity between Soviet victory and modern Russian military tradition. German perspective on Prokhorovka is complicated. Site represents German military defeat, but also German soldiers' valor and sacrifice. German veterans who survived Kursk and participated in post-war reconciliation efforts emphasize common humanity and tragedy of war rather than nationalism. Modern German military studies Kursk as a historical lesson rather than source of pride or shame. International military historians visit Prokhorovka to study battlefield terrain and understand tactical dynamics. The site offers insights into the largest tank battle in history that archival documents alone can't provide. Walking ground where combat occurred gives visual understanding of distances, visibility, terrain factors that influence battle. Germans never expected 800 Soviet tanks to counterattack at dawn because conventional military wisdom suggested such attack would be suicidal. German technological superiority. Tigers, Panthers, superior optics, better trained crews should have destroyed Soviet tanks at long range before they could close distance. The expectation was reasonable based on previous combat experience. But Soviet doctrine accepted suicidal tactics if they achieved strategic objectives. Rotmistrov's charge was deliberately sacrificial. Soviet commanders knew casualties would approach 50%. They ordered attack anyway because alternative, allowing Germans to continue offensive, would result in strategic defeat. The tactical sacrifice achieved strategic purpose, stopping German offensive at moment of maximum German commitment. The result was catastrophic for Soviet forces engaged, but strategic victory for Soviet Union. 340 tanks destroyed, thousands of casualties. But German offensive stopped. 2 SS Panzer corps exhausted. Operation Citadel failed. Germany never regained offensive capability in East. By accepting tactical defeat, Soviets achieved strategic victory that changed course of war. From July 5th to August 23rd, 1943, from German offensive begins the Soviet counteroffensives recapture Kharkov. From 1,500 tanks colliding at Prokhorovka to visibility dropping to zero in smoke and flames, the Battle of Kursk demonstrated that technology, without numerical superiority and strategic depth, couldn't win war of attrition. 800 Soviet tanks charging 600 German tanks at point-blank range. 12 hours continuous combat visibility, 0 tanks, fighting at 50 yards. Strategic reserves committed at critical moment to stop German breakthrough. The battle where Germany committed last offensive capability and lost. The operation where Soviet tactical defeats accumulated into strategic victory. The largest tank battle in military history where mass prevailed over technology. The 2 weeks that permanently shifted Eastern Front momentum and began Germany's long retreat to Berlin. Battle of Kursk, where Germans never expected Soviet Union to absorb catastrophic casualties and continue fighting, where 800 tanks charge at dawn into point-blank melee that determined strategic outcome, where technological superiority met numerical superiority, and numerical superiority won through sheer determination to accept any cause for victory.